Hello and welcome to Your County. I'm Lynne Turner Fitzgerald, your host. Joining me today is Heather Webster. And Heather, I'm going to let you give them your title because it's really long.
All right. I am a Deputy Chief County Attorney at Yellowstone County in our Dependency and Neglect Division, which is our foster care cases in Yellowstone.
Okay. So what do? You represent children, families?
No. So I represent the social workers in foster care cases. So as a county attorney, our role is to review affidavits and then file petitions that allow the state the authority to remove children from their parents' care due to abuse or neglect. So we don't represent the county attorney's office, then does not represent the kids in the cases, but rather the state, essentially. And that's our job, is to make sure that the social workers are filing legally sufficient affidavits in order to remove children from their parents. So that's my role.
Well, I would think in some cases, removing a child from an abusive situation could have a very tight timeline to it.
Yes, very much.
So how quickly is the response?
So social workers themselves have the centralized intake number that many of your viewers will have probably called into if they've suspected child abuse or neglect. There are mandatory reporters, and then there are, of course, just instances where personally you could see alarming situations. So the centralized intake is a number for statewide. They assign a priority to those reports. So there can be a report that needs to be investigated in under 24 hours, one that is under, I think it's 72 hours, and then one that is 10 days. And the under 24 hours means the social worker needs to get out there pretty quickly.
Right.
Oftentimes in Yellowstone, we see those reports happen when parents are being arrested. So quickly, someone needs to come and take a child.
Right.
So that's the initial time frame that social workers are working under, or child protection specialists is how our statutes refer to our workers as. Once a worker has determined they need to remove a child and actually have legal involvement, then they have 48 hours they have to right away serve a notice or hand a notice to a parent. They provide that to our office. Within 48 hours, they have to have an affidavit to us and to the parent's side of things, so the public defender's office. And then within 5 business days, we need to have filed our petition and have an initial hearing. So it all moves pretty quickly. I imagine as a parent, it doesn't feel that fast when your children have been removed from your care.
Right.
But we really have sped things up in the past few years. In Montana, it used to take much longer to see judges. Up to 20 days is how our statute used to read. And now it's 5 business days.
Where's the child during all of this legal stuff going on?
Yes. So our statutes and then also the department's policy requires that we initially try to place with family very first. So a lot of times in our cases, kids are with grandparents, aunties and uncles, sometimes with neighbors who feel like what we refer to as fictive kin. And so a lot of times that's where kids are.
Okay.
Otherwise, they have been placed into foster care, which sometimes people refer to as stranger foster care, meaning they are licensed foster care providers who don't have an existing relationship with a child.
Okay.
The other thing that our social workers have done a really amazing job of in the past few years are working what are called voluntary services agreements with parents. And they can get one of those reports, a priority 1, 2, or 3, and then they can work voluntarily with a family to provide them services, sometimes to still remove a child voluntarily from the parent's care while they're attending treatment or doing some sort of monitoring of drug and alcohol abuse typically. And so there are a lot of kids that I don't ever see. I don't ever get an affidavit that they've been formally removed. Because the department is really trying to work with families to keep them intact, to really try to decrease our numbers of legal filings, because the legal system is really stressful, and certainly
Cumbersome.
Yes. Yeah. And that kind of antagonism, like the fighty fight that can happen.
Yeah.
Social workers really try to avoid that for families, because what we want to do is make them whole and have them be able to safely parent.
Well, tell me some numbers here. How many children are in care at this point in Yellowstone County?
In Yellowstone County, I believe there are 587 children in open proceedings where we have a case open in district court in Yellowstone County.
That seems high to me.
Yes.
Is it?
Yes, it is higher than we would all want it to be.
Yeah.
Our numbers have gone down. Another spot with those voluntary services agreements that the department has really done a great job on. I believe it was 2017 was our highest numbers, and I don't have exactly what those numbers were, but our numbers have decreased pretty significantly over the past, basically since 2017.
Well, how does that compare to, say, other states or around the country?
Really high.
They're really high.
Our per capita, because our population is so much lower, we do have high numbers of kids in care. And that has been a real focus for the department over these past few years of trying to, again, with those voluntary services agreements, try to keep families intact and out of the actual formal legal system.
Can you explain the voluntary agreement to me a little deeper?
Yep.
What is required of the parent if they enter into one of these?
Yes. So what is required is primarily a cooperative parent who knows they need some help. And then typically the agreements contain usually some drug and alcohol monitoring. They contain some safety resources, which can mean a community member that has agreed to come and check on the family every day. There can also be certain things like agreements to take kids to daycare every day so that there are other people who are seeing their children.
Good, yeah.
And then there can be some mental health work. Sometimes then there can be, the department can request the parent to do a chemical dependency evaluation or a mental health evaluation, and see what those recommendations from those professionals might be. And then if the department on a voluntary agreement is able to help a parent, get back on Medicaid or with their private pay insurance, figure out how they can get themselves going on some treatment. A lot of times, if there are people who are safe that are able to help support those parents, the department doesn't have to do a formal case because they're able to mitigate for the safety concerns for kids.
Right.
So certainly there are a lot of people who are drug or alcohol dependent who don't have their children removed. And mostly that's because there are safety resources that families able to put into place.
Okay.
That, and a lot of times, of course, people who have more privilege and more resources are able to, have safe family members who kind of help them get their kids to school and help with those things. So that's where I think the department can really help parents sort of see where the lack of safety exists for their children and how to put some of those measures into place.
Right. But the goal then being keep the family together while they work on the issues.
Yes.
Who does the reporting, though? Who reports child abuse?
So there are...
Or neglect.
Yeah. So there are the mandatory reporters, like doctors, teachers.
Oh, sure.
Counselors. And then law enforcement. The department does keep track of who calls.
Sure.
And a lot of that are law enforcement, and then also people who are just community members, not necessarily mandatory reporters. And those reporters are confidential. Those are not names that are given to parents. That's really one of the only places that our statute doesn't allow some flexibility for obtaining those kinds of records.
Yeah.
Parents can see otherwise anything else that the department would investigate regarding their levels of safety, but the reporter has stayed confidential.
And how do you know that the report is legitimate? I mean, could somebody try to weaponize that system to get even, or?
They could. The great part about the training that the CPS workers go through is There are a lot of safety models that they utilize. And so while they are required to go out on any report, because of course we want to make sure kids are safe, they really do a nice job of sussing that out. It has been a super rare, I don't think that I've received an affidavit that
that's good.
that has had that.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking in a contentious divorce or something like that.
They're absolutely
one parent could against the other parent.
Yes. Yep. And the workers do see that in their investigations, but then we in the formal legal system don't end up seeing those.
Okay.
Typically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, at certain ages, does a child ever report their own instance to you folks?
I haven't had one that I can think of where a child has called the hotline themselves.
Yeah.
But by making disclosures to trusted adults, then that's how we can get those reports. Because yes, a number of our cases come from children's disclosures of abuse or significant neglect. So
is there a standard or typical amount of time that child is removed from the family?
I don't think that I'm not sure
if
there is a set amount. Our cases are typically open anywhere from 12 to 24 months.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean that kids are out of their parents' care for that long. So the goal of all of our cases, even once we have to formally get involved, is to reunify families.
Yes.
That is absolutely the goal. So as soon as we can mitigate for the safety concerns, that is something that the department is always monitoring whether or not parents have met what we call conditions for return. Mm-hmm. So meaning that safely we can put kids back in the house.
Okay.
And so that doesn't mean that somebody has to be all the way through treatment or, you know, when people struggle with mental health or chemical dependency, those are lifelong struggles that parents will have. And so we're not expecting that you would magically wake up one day and be a perfect parent. Mm-hmm. And no one's a perfect parent. So
yes, bingo.
So the hope is that then we've at least gotten, because children really do best if they're with their parents. Mm-hmm. That's as soon as they can be back with them, that is really best for kids.
Sure.
So that's how the federal Adoptions and Safe Families Act requires that if a child has been in care for 15 of the last 22 months, there's a presumption that termination of parents' rights is in a child's best interest.
Oh.
There are a lot of exceptions to that rule, and you know, the department, I mean, again, we really try to avoid having to terminate parents' rights. There's nothing worse for a parent. You don't have your children and think you'll have them removed from you. You know, that's awful. Mm-hmm. So I think we really try, even as we get into those cases that kids have been out of their parents' care, they are seeing their parents regularly. They're hopefully in some services themselves because it's traumatic to be removed from your parents. So I'm not totally sure the length of stay, and our department people will be like, Heather, you should know that. But anyway, I am
That's
not
okay.
certain. But
well, so you mentioned some federal regulations.
Yes.
And then our state legislature also can change things.
Yes.
Which they have done.
Yes.
So tell me about the changes.
So the primary changes this past session or two has been really a focus on getting parents before judges more quickly, which is great.
Yeah.
And then also really trying to make sure that the efforts are being fully made for children to be returned to their parents' care. So two things that were passed this last session that were exciting were the Montana Indian Child Welfare Act, which then put the federal Indian Child Welfare Act and codified it into Montana law, which is really exciting. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think one of the best parts of our state.
What was the improvement?
The improvement was making sure that if federally that law continues to be challenged, which this last year at the U.S. Supreme Court, the Indian Child Welfare Act was upheld as constitutional. The goal was for tribes and then the state partners who work with tribes on these cases was to really make sure that those protections continue no matter what for our state Indian children. And I think, tribes say all the time, and the U.S. Supreme Court case law says, that children are the tribe's greatest resource. And so the best we can do for our tribal members, really, that's so important. Another part of our statute, or another statute set, another set of bills focused on what they called ICWA for all. That's not what it's been called in the statutes themselves, but essentially raising the bar on the efforts that the social workers need to make towards reunification for children who do not fall under the Indian Child Welfare Act.
Oh, okay.
So non-native kids in Montana. And so that has certainly raised the bar on the efforts that the department needs to make. I will say that the workers that I work with, really have put in those sorts of efforts over the years regardless, but I think having it codified is great. And then there has also been statutes passed regarding children's attorneys. In some of our more rural parts of our state, attorneys for children had not been statutorily required.
Okay.
So there has always been some level of representation for kids. And what had been required before was a CASA or a guardian ad litem.
Explain those two terms, would
Yes,
you please?
sorry. A court-appointed special advocate is what CASA stands for, and they are a group of incredible volunteers in our state. CASA is a national program, and then there's a statewide CASA, and then local offices as well. So our Billings CASA office is really amazing, and their volunteers are really incredible. So,
and they do have quite extensive training, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
They're required to do 40 hours of training. And then they keep their numbers low, that each volunteer is only able to take a certain number of families per year. And then they see the children at least once a month. They write monthly reports to the parties and to the court to keep tabs on how the kids are doing. And then typically in Montana, the way we refer to the guardian ad litem or guardians ad litem is most of those folks are attorneys.
Yeah.
And so in Yellowstone County, we've been really lucky that for a long time, years and years, there have always been attorneys that have been representing the kids' best interests in these cases.
How do they know what the best interest is if it's an infant?
Yes. Some of it is substituting your own judgment. But then there is a list of what is best interest standards for kids.
Oh, okay.
And gives some guidance.
Okay.
And then attorneys do a lot of training over the years. But there are trainings for child's attorneys, guardians ad litem, that people are able to attend, which our guardians ad litem have a lot of training. But in other parts of our state, there were either fewer volunteers, that there were CASA offices really having to carry the bulk of that.
Right.
And so this year, the legislature added that each child must have an attorney. And then the statute that had existed before regarding a guardian ad litem or CASA still exists. So children have an attorney in fact. And it's funny that you asked that of how do you know what's best? It's interesting because the attorney, in fact, trying to represent what an infant wants. They want to eat and sleep.
Yeah, and poop.
And poop.
And that's it.
That's it. That's what they want. And
maybe a chew toy now and again.
Exactly. And so that, I think, is some substituted judgment for those attorneys have done some training about trying to kind of figure that out.
Right.
So that has been a big change too, to have now in Yellowstone, we have attorneys for the children. We still have our attorneys that are the guardians ad litem. In some counties, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Isn't that a duplication though, if you have the guardian ad litem is an attorney and then you have another attorney?
It definitely can be. And I think that there is some figuring that out right now that's happening in Yellowstone.
Because it just got a lot more expensive.
Yes.
Adding another attorney to the room.
It did.
And those are taxpayer dollars.
Yes.
Okay.
I feel really lucky to practice in Yellowstone because our cases are incredibly collaborative. We really, even though I mentioned that court cases can be, of course, antagonistic,
Sure.
that because these cases are focused so much on getting families back together, that it is a much more collaborative area of legal practice than others can be. And so I think those attorneys, in fact, the GALs, the CASA office, I think everyone really is trying to work together.
Yeah. You all kind of have the same goal.
Yeah.
And that is to reunite the family.
Yep.
Get the children back.
Yeah. And then if we can't, I think all of us that work in these cases, I mean, obviously we can't live an ideal world all the time, but really try to put in the effort during the case to make sure that if we are not agreeing at some points, it's not because for a lack of communication. So I primarily practice in front of Judge Souza and in our Indian Child Welfare Act court. And he always talks about how collaboration leads to communication. Communication leads to better outcomes for kids. And that's it. It's really true.
The goal is admirable. I mean, the work is admirable, but how do you do it? It's got to be heartbreaking at times.
Yeah, this last year has been really difficult. There have been some really incredibly sad cases. I do feel lucky that most of our cases, we really don't have a high number of cruel physical abuse cases. You know, most often it's that parents don't have the education on how to discipline their children without having lost their marbles.
Okay.
Or because of drugs and alcohol, they don't know what they're doing while they're hurting their children, you know? We don't have a super high number of sex abuse cases either. But there are some cases that just will always, like, you know, they always stick with me. And, you know, the parents in our cases love their children. And it's so heartbreaking when they can't do it.
Well, do you meet the children?
I rarely meet the children.
Okay.
I was a guardian ad litem from 2010 to 2015. I loved that job so much. Representing the kids' best interest is the best job. It's an amazing job. So I met all kinds of kids during those 5 years. Now I sometimes meet, sometimes teenagers will come to court, so we'll meet them.
Okay.
If we end up doing guardianships instead of reunification, meaning, you know, instead of termination and adoption, if we are able to do a guardianship, a lot of times kids will come to court for that with their guardian, which is really sweet.
Yeah.
And then the family recovery courts, so there's one in front of Judge Fair and one in front of Judge Souza. I'm not the prosecutor in those courts now, of those treatment courts, but the family recovery court in front of Judge Fair and previously Judge Todd, I had been the prosecutor in that court for a long time. And those courts do a lot of family functions. So when I was the prosecutor in those courts, or in the recovery court, I did get to meet the kids a lot, which was awesome. And so many of those kids are home with their parents, and so it's really fun to get to see them with their parents. And different family days are so fun. Like there was one year where there was a science fair that the kids did. And that was incredibly fun. So it was great to see those kids.
All right.
Yeah.
Personally, though, I mean, were you aiming this direction all your life, do you think?
No.
Okay.
I don't think I was.
Okay.
In college, I thought I would run a theater.
Oh, sure.
So I have a dance degree and a business degree. And then when I was done with my undergrad and was really trying to figure out what to do, I had always thought about going to law school. My dad was an attorney.
Yeah, your dad.
And then after he suddenly passed away, I was really inspired by my mom being able to have her career as a nurse and be able to continue to support her kids and have a job and have her insurance and all of those things. And so when I was thinking about, okay, what could I do? And I, you know, being a lawyer had always been in my mind. And then once I was in law school, criminal law did not appeal to me. Some of the other civil type work did not appeal to me either. And I took a
The
child
more
advocacy.
contentious
Yes.
cases, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, sure.
I took a child advocacy class from, now she's a judge in Missoula, Leslie Halligan is her name. I loved that class. It was amazing. And so then once I was in my beginning baby lawyer years here in Billings, I clerked for Judge Fegg the first year.
Sure.
And he really thought I should do the guardian ad litem stuff. That was really,
That's nice, though.
It
Get
was
a little nudge like that.
It was great.
Yeah.
So I worked for a law firm for a couple of years before I went out on my own and became a GAL. And the mentors I had at the Hendrickson Law Firm really changed my life too. And so I did family law, like divorces and parenting plans. And the hard part about that is what I mentioned, where not everybody has the common goal.
No,
So
that's right.
That's really exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's how I ended up here.
Great.
Yeah.
We have run out of time.
gosh, that
I
went
know,
so
it
fast.
went fast, didn't it?
Sorry, that
but
went
no,
so
I
fast.
want to thank you, Heather,
Oh my
for
gosh, thanks,
being here.
Lynne.
It was really informative.
You are the best.
And we'll have you back again sometime.
Okay, great. My colleagues in my county attorney office, there's 3 other women that practice with me. They're incredible, wonderful people.
Okay.
And they would be wonderful
We have
guests.
choices then.
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again, Heather
Thank you so
Webster.
much.
Thanks for joining us on Your County. We hope you join us next time.